I have always had an affinity for the state of New Mexico. It is so rich in American history and was the home for some of the most notable post-war outlaws from the ashes of the Civil War. Names like Buck Shaw Roberts, Charlie Bowdre, Pat Garrett, and Billy the Kid. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, now in its second year from the Weather Network in Canada. So New Mexico's most notorious gunslingers from that period, known as the Wild West, got into some real unusual tangles, but none so unlikely or unusual or dangerous for that matter as the snow of winter mixing it up with a tornado. This day in weather history. Okay, so I could literally go on for days on post-war America and its violent struggles to finish founding all 50 states in the afterglow of a deadly and brutal Civil War. And maybe one day that will be a new podcast, but that is not today. Today I hit on the Snow-nado. I say it like that because it makes me laugh. Yes, a rare Snow-nado in a location not necessarily known for this kind of a snow mix-up, New Mexico. So we had two rarities in one. A rancher filmed what looked to have been a weak landspout that touched down in eastern Navajo Nation in Torreon, New Mexico. The National Weather Service in Albuquerque confirmed it to indeed have been a landspout. But for it to be a landspout, it is from the tornado family. Now, that is rare here. A landspout, as I have explained on this podcast before, is a tornado that does not come from an organized area of low pressure, so therefore it is not associated with a wall cloud. That's dangerous. Also, landspouts are typically observed beneath towering cumulus clouds, making them basically the same as a waterspout, just, over land. Welcome to year 2 of this podcast. Right now, you're listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider, but there's also the daily podcast video short. They're shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective, but oftentimes they will include visuals from that day's event from when it happened in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. And just to dovetail from that if I can, I'd like to remind you where you can catch this podcast if you might be picking this up off our site or from within a story. You can look up or ask for This Day in Weather History, wherever you normally listen to your favorite podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Alexa, and now every day on yahoo.ca. Right. The National Weather Service went on to say that it was the first tornado-ish event on record for New Mexico during the month of February. I told you it was rare. But getting back to the hook for This Day in Weather History, it was speculated that this was the first ever documented snow tornado in the United States. And just like that, we got ourselves a story. So, what happened? A snow squall showed up on radar, but it had the readings to show that it was much higher than most snow events. It grew to nearly 20,000 feet in altitude up in the atmosphere. The squall actually formed along colliding outflow boundaries. And with the change in wind direction along that boundary, this helped develop a strong enough updraft to create an amount of shear and, therefore, weak rotation. The good news from the aftermath is that there was no damage reported, and it was apparently so inconsequential that the NWS did not even send a team out to survey the scene. Hey, not all are heavy hitters, but it was rare for this location when it happened in New Mexico. This day in weather history. Hey, do you like the podcast? We'd love to hear from you. If you have an idea, go right now to wherever you're listening to me and rate us if you would, please. It's on a 5-star system, and we would love as many stars as you can afford. So rate us, but then also review us. This way we can always stay on top of how you'd like to see the show evolve. Then remember to subscribe to this podcast. Click the subscribe or follow button right there on the very same podcast homepage you're listening on. You'll be immediately reminded that the next day is ready to listen to, and you also have access to every episode in the archives. It dates back to June 1st of 2020, so there is a lot that we got to get caught up on this day in weather history. Tomorrow is February 18th. And we are revisiting the historically colossal storm that was called White Juan. This beat the living daylights out of our Canadian maritime provinces and was made all the worse because it followed only 5 months after Hurricane Juan tore the area apart. On this day in weather history, with me, your host, Chris May.